All right, that should work now. All right, that should work now. Oh, why didn't it? Okay, here we go. Can you still hear me?
Uh-huh.
Okay, I didn't mess that part up. Good. Um, all right, so I think we should be ready for our second big live stream presentation here. Um, we have a couple of guests here on our Zoom meeting, and then we have a couple of viewers remotely coming in also. And so, thank you, Heather, for agreeing to tell us a little bit about your current work. I think it's going to be very exciting to learn a little bit more about your work on matter and materials. And so it's going to be about, I don't know, 30-minute-ish presentation. Then we should have time for a little bit of a Q&A afterwards if anybody has any questions also. So I will put myself on mute and Heather can take over the show.
Hello, world. I don't know how many of you are out there because I can't totally see the roster of attendees, but thank you for joining in. I'm going to actually more or less read. I will do some of it off the cuff, but because I can't see any faces, it's really like speaking into the void, which is a strange format in both senses, sort of disarming, but also fairly interesting in some ways. So I'm going to talk a lot about some histories of matter, which either have been kind of unexposed or happen in a kind of register of culture where they've sort of flown under the radar for a long time. So the great British science writer Philip Ball once said that manipulating matter is part of what it means to be civilized. And this was essentially his definition of civilization. It's one of the central human impulses to transform the material of the world as we find it into the sweep of artifacts that we come to call cultural production. So the substances of the world exist in fixed quantities with only the possibility of being redistributed, recomposed, or transfigured through time. After several million years, the violence of a geologic event may usher forth an unrefined bit of gold onto the shoal of a river, the possibility of a goldsmith one day fashioning a coin, and eventually the coin's surrender to another depositional affair in the tectonic envelope of the planet. So for half an hour or so, I'm going to tell stories about matter, stories about the particularities and curious conditions of different substances that exist on this little sphere of spit and sand that we call Earth. Stories about how matter becomes artifacts and how artifacts may eventually, under the right conditions, become matter again. When we talk about the impulse to manipulate, there are matters of degree that need to be acknowledged first. So it's important at the beginning here to make some distinctions between what we call matter, material, object, and artifact. And these are definitions that come slightly from scientific fields and material research, but are also a bit shaped by my own experiences. So matter we could define as the physical substances of the world as distinct from energy. It's stuff. Material is matter from which things can be made. Matter is motivated or directed by intentionality. In other words, for a substance to become a material, it has to be acknowledged by something with a cognitive system, like a human or a honeybee or, say, an octopus. Objects are things made of matter, but they don't necessarily come into being by way of human intention. So a felled tree in a forest, or the shell of a scalp that we might pick up on a beach could be considered objects. Human-made things can be objects too, but not necessarily. Artifacts are distinctly human. They're enunciated through human cultural authorship, which means that humans first have to kind of make from matter by investing it with a kind of identity of material. And so these are sort of the working definitions that will help us orient and kind of shape where we're headed for the next few minutes here. So here we have 100 on the very left. We have a 100-pound piece of lapis lazuli that's being carried out of the mountains in Afghanistan. When lapis is broken down into smaller geometric pieces and used for, say, the mosaic or inlay, like in the center image, that's sort of one register of material refinement. We're getting the cops coming for me. Can you hear them? When that lapis is ground down into a powder, measured out and written into the specifications of a Renaissance painting contract, which states that it may only be used to articulate the cloth of the Virgin Mary, that's another level of refinement altogether. So another way of thinking about this is that a stand of trees in a forest is essentially a kind of a condition of substance. When a human walks into that forest and begins to identify a felled tree as a piece of timber, it's then translated into a material because it's been identified as something that has a kind of quotient of utility. When that timber is then sawn and turned into lumber, we start to get into the business, not quite yet of artifact, but close, right? We're still kind of in the realm of material. And then by the time we do things with it, like take wood pulp and make paper, we're well on our way. So some of these issues of material refinement and the motivations behind them were made clear in the 18th century when men of the neoclassical persuasion began rooting around in the ground in Italy, as they did in 1786 here when they began to excavate Pompeii. And what they discovered, this caused nothing short of an existential and aesthetic crisis within architecture and within what was then an emerging field of archaeology. And these same people that were digging around began to write treatises that were titled things like, "What Ought We to Build?" They were so unsettled by the possibility that the classical world was not predicated on an expression in white marmoreal geometries, and that nearly a century of such influence had been totally misunderstood by them. Eventually, and curiously enough, a colleague in the discipline of painting piped up and sort of said, "Hey guys, you're really asking the wrong questions. It's not a situation of blasphemy where the ancients were committing sacrilege by endeavoring to mar their marble temples in pigment. The traditional preparatory ground for canvas since the invention of easel painting had been gesso, which at the time was made from marble dust." And so what this proposes, this material fact, presents another possibility that marble could actually be the ideal surface for accepting pigment, and that marble was chosen perhaps precisely because its value system as a material favors paint, which is an idea that is so radical in terms of how it reprioritizes the relationships between the discipline of painting and the discipline of architecture, that it became impossible for these people to kind of entertain it as an idea, and it was quickly sort of suppressed. But it remains a very fascinating proposition, I think. Sorry, I went one too far. Not long after I moved to Los Angeles, which was a while ago now, this image entered my field of vision. And in it, I felt a very, very profound sense of confrontation that at the time I couldn't quite put my finger on. So if you're traveling east on the transcontinental highway, which is the 10 east toward the high desert of the low desert of Palm Springs, or it splits and becomes the high desert of, say, Joshua Tree, you undoubtedly pass the Outpost of Cabazon. That's what this is. A hamlet of service stations, and more recently, an abject casino flanked by a fortified mirage of outlet stores. In the early 1960s, Claude Bell, a theme park artist, brokered the addition of a pair of concrete dinosaurs, which we see here, Tyrannosaurus and a Brontosaurus. Now, it ought to be the case that these specimens of dubious paleontology should register as the idiosyncratic elements in the landscape, but they are, in fact, the things which seem most at home in the sublime prehistoric light of the desert floor. What one is confronted with here is an object lesson in the relationship between the figural and the abstract. We're caught in a riptide between the figural embodiment of our Jurassic pair and their actual presence as fossil fuels in the subterranean holding tanks of the service stations, which of course go on to perform controlled explosions in the engines of our automobiles as they propel us across antediluvian landscapes and ancient seafloors. John McPhee, the brilliant writer of all things, particularly all things geological, reminds us that, quote, petroleum, the transmuted fossils of ocean algae, forms when the rock that holds the fossils becomes heated to the temperature of a cup of coffee and remains as warm or warmer for at least 1 million years. So the Brontosaurus of Sinclair Oil or the yellow scallop of the Shell Oil Company is an indexical signpost for the ancient sea slurry that has been undergoing petrochemical transformation under our feet for millions of years. McPhee also reminds us that oil is fat, and we happen to be living in a historical moment where the precarity of the entire human species is subject to the temperament of a fat. This is profound. Let me explain. So a virus, specifically the coronavirus, exists somewhere between chemistry and biology. This is a poignant this is very poignant relative to the territory that we're going to walk around in right now, because it hints at the possibility of a virus being both a substance and simultaneously an agent of manipulation. I don't quite know how to categorize this, but it isn't exactly equivalent to a rock carving itself, but it's not that. Outside of the body, a virus is not alive. But in a host, it can switch on behaviors that ape one of the most essential acts of a living organism, which is reproduction. In the centuries since the 1918 outbreak of influenza, the scientific community has established that a virus is a protein molecule covered by a protective layer of fat. And this is called a lipid membrane. The virus itself is actually quite fragile and is only protected by this thin outer layer of fat. Soap can dissolve this layer of fat, destabilizing the protein molecule. Heat melts fat. Alcohol over 65% dissolves it. Ultraviolet light breaks it down. This is why we're performing all these hygienic rituals at the moment, scrubbing our hands with hot water and using hand sanitizer. But in truth, when we do these things, we're not killing the virus. By definition, the virus was never alive outside of the body. When we wash our hands, what we're actually doing is dissolving the fat that blankets the virus, and the virus then loses its agency. I think someone's got their mic on. Christoph, maybe you can mute everybody except me.
Yeah.
Sure. This is the tale of another lipid, another fat. We're standing, at least in imagination, in one of the galleries of La Specola, a very rare and disarming collection in the Museum of Zoology and Natural History in Florence. And if anyone ever has the chance to go, it's fairly life-changing. I would recommend it. It's important to remember that at the time, dissection had only recently been allowed. It had been heretical for essentially all of human history up until maybe 50 years before this point. And methods of embalming were definitely not anything like they are today. So it was very challenging to look into an opened body to understand the living systems through a corpse, while the body is essentially rotting. And so one's challenged with all of the kind of sensorial difficulties of that, which was the primary motivation, one of the primary motivations for commissioning these models in wax. So the modeling of these figures from beeswax depended upon many aspects of the formal, behavioral, cultural, and economic conditions of the material itself. It was an abundant, ubiquitous, and local substance that Florentines used in nearly all aspects of life: the preservation of food, the security of private documents, towards medicinal and cosmetic ends, as sealants, lubricants, or votive offerings, and perhaps most significantly as the fuel to extend the day into darkness through, of course, the candle. Wax was cheap, malleable, and able to carry pigment in order to color and differentiate the distinct tissues of the human body. Significantly, it also has the translucency very similar to flesh. The French philosopher and art historian Georges Didier Huberman praises its physical virtues in almost religious terms when he says, "Wax is the material of all resemblances. Its figurative virtues are so remarkable that it is often considered a prodigious, magical material, almost alive, and disquieting for that very reason." These lifelike qualities have much to do with the conditions under which beeswax is actually formed. The interior temperature of a beehive is carefully regulated and maintained at 95 degrees by the colony, 95 degrees Fahrenheit, which is close to the internal temperature of the human body, which we know, of course, to be 98.6. At around 144 degrees, wax crosses the threshold from solid to liquid, the approximate temperature at which human skin burns with a signature blister. The propinquities and behavior between wax and flesh is part of what makes us attribute the vitality to it. In contrast to the inorganic substances of bronze or marble, beeswax is actually a living material, the result of a long chain of biological processes. Like Susini's wax models at La Specula, the Ware collection in the Natural History Museum at Harvard pushes a material to its physical limit, and in this case, glass. So these botanical specimens that you're looking near are actually fully rendered in glass, impossibly so. Leopold and Rudolf Blaschke were commissioned by the university to produce a collection of glass botanical models for study, much like Susini's wax figures. They had been found making models of sea creatures in their workshop just outside of Dresden in Germany, and the need to arrest the dynamic life cycle and eccentricities of the botanical world were deemed appropriate in glass given its visual and physical properties. So it turns out that glass is really a state of matter rather than a single material. It forms when a molten substance with enough silica cools rapidly before it can form a crystalline lattice. So glass is a rigid liquid, and there are actually a few kinds of glass which are naturally occurring. Fulgurites, which is on the left here, are formed, they're hollow tubes that are formed when lightning strikes sand. So they obviously occur on beaches and in deserts. Tectites, which are also called Libyan desert glass or moldavite, are created when meteors hit the earth. And then obsidian is a volcanic glass formed from molten rock. So it's often found lining the interiors of volcanoes. There's a fourth type, which is actually tied to the animal kingdom in a strange way. So that certain marine creatures like algae and sponges have enough silica in their biological makeup that under the right environmental conditions, when they're exposed to the right amount of heat for the right duration of time, can actually be turned into glass. They're quite astonishing when you see them. There's an origin myth of man-made glass that I quite love, and it goes like this. An Egyptian sledge carrying megalithic blocks to build the pyramids was dragged across the desert floor and created enough friction to vitrify the sand underneath it, leaving a thin sheet of glass in its wake, a bit like a snail trail. I'm quite sure that this isn't true, but I like apocryphal tales, so So I'm in the midst right now of writing a book of experimental nonfiction about the substances of the world. And I thought I would conclude by reading a few portions on air, wool, and salt to you. So we will, as I said, begin with air. 5,200 feet. We were a flightless species until 1783, when a hot air balloon was untethered from the ground, delivering a pair of Frenchmen into the sky over Paris. And despite our classification as land-dwelling creatures, we live in the sky. We inhabit a medium that sweeps between the bodies of interstellar space and is brought down through an accumulating gradient of gases and gravity to kiss the surface of the Earth and to flood the small twinned voids of our chest cavity without interruption. The thin skin of air dressed around the planet is not so much an envelope as it is a valence containing meteorological routines where sunsets perform high wire acts alongside percussive updrafts of air, and the horizon stands up out of the sea to announce the curvature of the Earth. 35,000 feet. On June 28, 1939, a Wednesday on the flat glacial moraine of Long Island, a Pan Am Boeing B-314 lifted off of a tarmac in Port Washington and flew by way of the Azores to Marseille, establishing the first commercial transatlantic flight and opening the firmament to global travel. The 22 passengers on board drank tea and coffee from delicate china and spread marmalade on toast with silver butter knives, while their aircraft passed through the abstractions of 6 time zones, obscured by the incredulity of speed and soft boundaries of cloud. At the inconspicuous moment when the tires of the plane parted from the ground, the vast distances of the world collapsed and were converted into hours. The duration of a flight from Paris to Shanghai could host the entirety of Wagner's Ring Cycle. The hemispheric reach from Tokyo to Buenos Aires could now be accomplished in just over a day, and the antipodes of the Earth were now experienced as adjoining nations, welded by a technological transgression, flying either into or out of the sunset faster than the rotation of the planet. 100,000 feet. 2 months into the reign of Titus Flavius Caesar, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon on August 24th, the sky over the Bay of Naples was punctured by a ballistic event that sent a rain of parabolic cinders down onto a constellation of Roman towns and ancestral farms for nearly a day. In the end, over 9 feet of fine volcanic powder covered the countryside. The first stage of the eruption was known as the Plinian feature, named after a 17-year-old boy who would become sole chronicler of the geologic event. They say that the eruption was caused by seawater, or more specifically, that seawater had seeped into the province of the volcano, producing inestimable amounts of steam as it came into contact with subcutaneous magma. It would have taken a great deal of time to mount such a cataclysmic assault. In its accrual, the fishermen may have noticed small changes in the behavior of clams and eels, or that the shallows seemed ever more shallow. Perhaps the shepherd's staff began to double as a divining rod, picking up tremors that would soon reach their inexorable detonation. But no matter, on August 24th, Vesuvius ejected rock over 100,000 feet into the air, surpassing the summit of Everest by 13.5 miles. Wool. On an unremarkable morning at the onset of the 15th century, sheep could be witnessed grazing the Flemish countryside, unaware of the era. They would roam as they did for thousands of years, before there were windmills or monarchies, before the crucifixion, each step unencumbered by the liabilities of knowing. A sheep does not know that the grass it is masticating will be converted to protein in the mystery of its 4 Byzantine stomachs, and expressed through its follicles as a constellation of fibers, varying in density, thickness, and crimp. The coat of this creature evolved over eons to insulate it from the asperities of winter. Its fleece has adapted to hold air and heat and value. The hide of a sheep is a division of offerings. The side of its skin adjoining its organs can be dried and stretched to become vellum, inscribed with the coastlines of the known world. The outer surface, which addresses the external world of commerce and governance, will clothe a populace, and will be responsible for the expansion of wealth in a limestone city on the Italian peninsula. In the first years of the 15th century, Florence was struggling to rebound. Sorry, I'm managing two files here. In the first years of the 15th century, Florence was struggling to rebound from another devastating plague, coupled with a severe grain shortage and the mounting threat of Giangalezzo Visconti's recent capture of neighboring Pisa. This conflation of woe was the tinder that caused the Arte di Calamala, the Guild of Cloth Finishers and Merchants, to announce and fund a competition to design a pair of bronze doors for the baptistry of San Giovanni as a gesture of hope in dark times. 2 decades later, on April 19th, 1424, over 10 tons of bronze was set on hinges in the eastern portal of the baptistry. One can stand before the doors and calculate the consequences that brought them into being: the conversion of wool into wealth, the 2,000-mile-long journey of woolen cloth shipments arriving in Florence, traced back by carriage to the Porto Pisano on the Ligurian coast, their distribution and repacking upon arrival in Genoa, and the sea route experienced in reverse, west across the Mediterranean through the Straits of Gibraltar, along the coast of Portugal and the Bay of Biscay, to enter the maw of the English Channel and return to the port of origin in Southampton, Calais, or Bruges. But this time travel only takes us back to woolen cloth as a packaged commodity. From there, we can imagine freight merchants unbundling soft bales of fleece into an undifferentiated flock that doesn't bleat or move, but feels somehow living. In the quiet animation of the shearing blades, we see a shepherd magically returning fleece to the bodies of 20,000 animals, while on an unremarkable morning in the flat pasture of the Low Countries, sheep graze unaware. Salt. 38 parts per thousand. A single pink cloud shaped like a flounder hung above the water in the distance, drifting into other associations throughout the morning and eventually dissolving from view. The salinity of the ocean had been steadily increasing ever since the ship left the quay in London and sailed around the tip of Britannia. But this would have gone unnoticed as an effect upon the buoyancy of the vessel. The ship was now passing below the Balearic Islands. While at anchor for an evening, several members of the crew stole away an hour to swim in the strange incandescent waters of a cove. They would not have known that the ship was riding higher in the sea. That small increment would have been lost in the volatile rise and fall of the waterline against the hull. But one of them might have remarked, with a wince, on the sting that it brought to his eyes. He might even have claimed that the brine of the Mediterranean was caused by the tears of the Alps draining into the sea. Five parts per thousand. Tabloids widely reported that Andy Warhol frequented La Toile, a French restaurant on the Upper East Side, designed by Alexandre Girard in 1966. Its silvered interior might have appealed to him as an extension of the factory's stannic character, projected into the public domain. And although there are no confirmed reports as to whether or not he ever dined at the equally groundbreaking Mexican restaurant that Girard opened 6 years earlier in the Time Life building in Rockefeller Center, he might have been drawn to its intemperance, having seen an advertisement placed in the New York Times that read, "Will the lady who lost her composure during fiesta at La Fonda del Sol please come back this Sunday? Every performer in the restaurant loved you. Even the cops loved you. Fiesta starts at 1 p.m. La Fonda del Sol, 123 West 50th Street, Plaza 7-880. Andy may have contemplated ordering the most exotic sounding dishes, or found rapture in the typographic exuberance of escabeche set in Western block letters, among the dizzying wall of spatialized, sorry, Western block letters among a dizzying wall which spatialized the menu in full. A menu as a billboard, a menu delivered as a facade. After a sugary meal of banana baked in the skin with honey and a margarita on the rocks, Andy hails a cab to drive him 6 blocks east to his studio at 231 East 47th Street. Under the influence of glucose and tequila, he begins a new series of paintings, articulating in deadpan the labels of 32 varieties of canned soup, all of which share only 2 common ingredients: water and salt. He goes to bed at sunrise on an unsettled stomach, wondering if consomme or cream of asparagus will nourish his dreams, and hallucinates in monochrome about a walk across the Bolivian salt flats in 2 inches of standing water. Fini.
Well, thank you very much, Heather.
My pleasure. I'm going to, maybe you can stop sharing so that we can actually get more faces.
Or names
Or
rather than
names.
faces.
Stare into the void together.
Yeah. Well, yeah, thank you. That was really, I think, quite fascinating and interesting. And I'm always, I've heard some of your excerpts before already, and we talked about these things. And I always like this kind of combination of very kind of logical and rational connections between things that you talk about, things out of these kind of combinations. So I thought that was quite fascinating, definitely. But before I babble on, does anybody maybe have any questions? Any comments? Any praise?
Ingela's raised a hand.
I'm raising it really. And I'm sorry, I thought this started at 1:30, so I missed the intro. But as Christoph said, I've heard you speak about this before, and I think you speak so beautifully about material. Do you have a table of contents? I'd be really interested in seeing all the materials that you're looking at and how you select which materials to investigate.
Well, it's interesting because it's maybe not exactly the question you're asking, or not exactly the way that you're asking it, but I couldn't actually tell you when I started working on this book, because I think it's been churning in the background of my life, probably for all of my existence. But I think more formally, I started to really commit to publishing a book when I went on sabbatical, or just before I went on sabbatical, so a year and a half, 2 years ago. And not everyone knows this about me, but I actually have a background in creative writing. So I went to RISD as an undergrad and studied painting and architectural history. But there was an amazing thing that was possible back then, which has now actually been formalized as a degree, which is that you could, as a student at RISD, you could cross-register and take classes at Brown and vice versa. And so there was no formal degree granting procedure at the time, but essentially I took enough coursework at Brown that I could have essentially gotten a second degree in creative writing there, which was a really phenomenal experience that I had not intended at all when I set out to go to school, but was definitely a direct beneficiary of inadvertently. And so creative writing even more specifically, has always been a very vital kind of strand in the braid of my creative practice. And I struggled enormously when I was a painter with subject matter. I basically had a kind of existential crisis every time I knew I was getting close to finishing something, because I didn't know what to paint next. And at a certain point, well, it's a little hard to say exactly when, but definitely about 6 years ago, I realized that a lot of the things that I was actually trying to frame questions around were not terribly well suited for the practice of painting. And I happened to be on a residency at the time, and a really generous, very, very well-known architectural historian came for a studio visit and just said, honey, let it go. And so I basically stopped painting at that point and started producing sculpture. And what I realized actually was that I was very, very fascinated with the material world, the way that the non-human world comes to be enunciated and manipulated by us. And so when I started writing this book, I was trying to figure out a way to have essentially two projects working simultaneously, almost as Siamese twins. One being the content, the actual subjects of investigation, which might be wool or air or salt or wax. But the other project there, and actually in some ways the much more experimental one, was the how to write about it. And when I started, I actually thought I was going to have a series of essays, each one kind of discreetly organized around a particular material. I was fairly convinced that was going to be the form. And then the actual way, the actual language, the kind of syntax of the writing was the thing that I was looking at. And as I started to write it, I realized that it betrayed the ecology of the world, that the world does not operate in these kind of discrete, siloed conditions. And so I basically kind of had to pull the rug out from under myself and try and write my way into another form. And that's sort of where I'm at right now. And I couldn't actually tell you how the book will be organized, because I think my suspicion is that it will very easily and fluidly kind of slip in and out of narratives that implicate multiple things that we might call materiality or substance at the same time. So I'm sort of, it's a bit like reading tea leaves. I sort of write a bunch of things and then I sort of write something else and I figure out how they sit. And then the minute I write another thing, it all has to kind of get renegotiated. And so it's not a terribly efficient process, but it's incredibly exciting in terms of how I get to kind of participate in a dialogue with the stuff of the world and with history. And so to be determined, Ingelo. I don't know yet.
Thank you for that answer.
I think actually, for me, the interesting point about what you were just telling us about your process of writing there is also that in between your, for example, I just became aware of the fact that they started the excavations in Pompeii 1786, and then the first balloon flight was in 1783. So within 3 years, humanity started discovering underground and in the air. Yeah. And how that shifted everything at the same time. So I think there's these incidental connections that are probably more important than a linear perspective.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I go back and forth between just letting this thing kind of drag me around by the neck and let me end up somewhere, and the physical or even non-physical kind of delivery system of the writing, I think, is still up for debate. Yeah. And then there's another part of me that thinks that if all aspects of it are kind of feral, that it might actually need something conventional in its kind of physical form. But I'm totally undecided. I am. It's actually a nice process to just work on something and to not be terribly concerned with where I end up. And the interesting thing is I have a lot of friends that are writers, a lot of really close friends that are novelists. And I've never written a novel. I write short things. And I always ask them, how on earth do you sit down and commit to writing like a 400 or 500 page novel? I just can't. Yeah. My wiring doesn't allow me to kind of apprehend that kind of how one does that. And every single one of them to the last, although in slightly different ways, has basically said that it's like, a friend of mine who's an Indian writer has said to me that it's like getting into a car at night in fog and driving down a road, and you can only really see maybe 6 to 12 inches in front of you. and you have faith in whatever piece of the road and whatever piece of the landscape you can see in that given moment. And you don't really worry about the rest of what's in front of you. And if you just take it that way, you eventually end up somewhere.
Yeah.
And I've sort of allowed myself, emotionally and psychologically and kind of intellectually to live in that sort of 6 inches of clarity, or visibility. Maybe it's not clarity, but I always thought that was actually a really good kind of working metaphor for design, which is that, it's this discussion that I have, I feel almost every single day with my students, whether they're first year or fourth year or they're graduate students doing their thesis, which is this kind of anxiety about not knowing what one is doing. And it's absurd because it's the fundamental, first of all, it's the fundamental precondition of just being alive, but it's absolutely the precondition of design, which is that you're trying to represent or visualize something that doesn't yet exist. And you're simultaneously using the modalities of representation to birth the thing, right? To bring it into the world, the kind of carrying across the threshold, but then also to communicate with others and to generate discourse and discussion and feedback and fighting and conflict and all this other stuff. And that's really fascinating to me. It's one of the reasons that I love to teach thesis, because I love to be in the room, usually shoulder to shoulder, now kind of screen to screen, with someone who's actually confronting the individual terms of that for themselves. So,
speaking of that, any one of our thesis students, seniors, that would like to ask or comment anything?
This is when they're all going to drop off the call.
Yeah. Or anybody else, for that matter.
It's not necessary.
Yeah. No, if not, then
this is incredibly, I don't know, clinical way to. I don't even know where to look. I never look at the camera. I'm always looking at whoever's face is on the screen, which really means I'm staring like down there somewhere.
Yeah, in a strange angle.
And it's turning us all into mole people in terms of our social skills. But
well, okay, then thank you very much, Heather.
My pleasure.
Thank you for everybody that attended and came by. And
thank you. That was a fun lunch and learn.
Yes. Good.
Sorry, I turned it off when I was eating because I always think you don't want to see me eating. So.
But the funny thing is, if we were on the flesh, you wouldn't think twice about it.
Exactly.
So,
But it just seemed like, shoving radishes in my mouth seems, although it kind of works with the content, but.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks everyone for signing on. It was nice to see your name. I can see no faces except for Christoph and Ingela, who are flanking me right now. But it's nice to see names and to them.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's somebody.
Hi, Louise. Nice to see you, stranger. Okay.
Nice.
Well, I wish everyone good health out there. And
thank you. Thanks for doing this, Heather. Appreciate it.
It was my pleasure.